So recently, the Washington Post released an article in which the founders and most elite advocates of critical race theory respond to what they refer to as the unfounded American conservative attacks against it. I want to respond to the founders directly, since going to the source itself, the very creators of the CRT framework, means I can't be accused of strawmanning the position or taking anybody out of context when I critique their words. In the interest of time, I will only respond to the most relevant parts of the article itself, but I encourage you to read the entire thing, and I'll leave the link in the description below. In recent months, critical race theory has leapt from the classroom to conservative news networks, where it has been attacked as divisive. So within just the first few sentences of this paragraph, we learn something very interesting. After being told over and over again by CRT advocates and mainstream news networks that critical race theory is not being taught in American schools and classrooms,
critical race theory is not being taught in schools. Can it influence the way that some teachers teach? Yeah, but that's a good thing, right? Because race and racism is literally the building blocks of this country. So how can you not talk about it?
This statement seems to be an implicit admission to the contrary. It goes on, conservative activists and politicians have seized on the issue, often redefining the academic term to encompass nearly any examination of systemic racism. Again, this seems to be one of the most common and widespread tactics of critical race theorists to make the claim that CRT has been misrepresented and misused as a catch-all bogeyman term for the conservative right to encompass any idea or political position they don't like within it. But it may come as a surprise to the viewer that the push to make critical race theory synonymous with any kind of leftist race scholarship came not from the right, but from the crits themselves. In a paper for the UCLA Law Review, dated June of 2002, Kimberly Crenshaw writes, "The name critical race theory, now used as interchangeably for race scholarship as Kleenex is used for tissue, was basically made up, fused together to mark a possibility." In short, let's stop blaming conservatives for using critical race theory as a catch-all term to refer to any kind of race scholarship being pushed into American schools, as it was the crits themselves who first did this. As outlined in Critical Race Theory and Introduction, CRT was fueled by provocative ideas from its start. In 1980, Harvard Law professor Derek Bell argued that the Supreme Court's ruling in Brown v. Board of Education, which was the landmark decision that officially ended school segregation in America, failed to significantly improve the lives of black students, and that the decision only came about because the United States needed to improve its image around the world. Quote, "The interest of blacks in achieving racial equality will be accommodated only when it converges with the interests of whites," Bell wrote. The philosophical idea being referred to here is called interest convergence, which is Derek Bell's claim that all progress which has been made in America since the beginning of time has only been allowed to happen because it ultimately benefited the white majority. No progress in America has been made out of true virtue or generosity. It's always secretly been for the benefit of the white hegemony. This includes bloody conflicts like the Civil War, African American suffrage, giving women the right to vote, and anything else you can possibly think of.
In other words, the interests of those in power and Americans of racial and ethnic minority background must be the same in order for change to take place. That's the idea of interest convergence. With interest convergence, we can then see that critical race theory not only diagnoses the problem of racial oppression and systemic oppression, but it also indicates what the solution is.
Perhaps this foundational tenet of critical race theory, interest convergence, should give you some pause. That every moral and legal advancement in the United States has ultimately been a sham, a coldly calculated tactic which was only allowed to happen because it benefited the overarching white supremacy, is a deeply cynical belief, but it is a belief that lies at the root of critical race theory. Teaching this to children is not teaching history as such. It's teaching a particular, extremely cynical perspective about the validity of the American experiment. In fact, the highly controversial and criticized 1619 Project, which claims that the foundational values and tenets which lie at the heart of the United States Constitution are false, and instead that our entire nation was founded on the tenets of slavery, discrimination, and segregation, lies upon this very premise. It might again give you pause to know that the 1619 Project is being taught to children in American school classrooms.
I'm an English and social studies teacher in Chicago public schools at the high school level. And I'll talk a little bit about how we implemented the 1619 at the classroom level. So you can go to the next slide.
In preparing my students to talk about not only the 1619 Project, but other current events that I would bring into class. And just like my colleagues have said, you have to talk about politics. This is also an election year.
Our journey through studying the 1619 Project. And when I thought about how to unpack this work for them, I really thought it to be most important to connect the what with the why.
Can you explain the New York Times Magazine, the 1619 Project? Can you explain what this is? Because you talk about it in your op-ed.
Well, this is a work of fiction that's masquerading as history. This is a project from the New York Times where they are now teaching that the real founding of America was in 1619 when supposedly the first slaves were brought over here, and now they're saying that the real founding of America, the reason our country was started, was to defend and preserve slavery, which is completely not true. This project has been debunked by every leading historian on American history, but because of that, because it came from the left, because it's the New York Times, we're now giving them the power to educate our children. This is being institutionalized in the classroom. K through 12 schools around the country are now allowing the New York Times to dictate their curriculum, even though it's been completely debunked.
By September, President Donald Trump banned federal agencies from teaching critical race theory in trainings. President Biden has since reversed Trump's order, but conservatives have remained focused on the issue. In May, several GOP lawmakers introduced a bill to ban the teaching of critical race theory in federal institutions because they say it promotes discrimination and stokes division. I grew up attending segregated schools in the Jim Crow South during a time when people were treated differently based on the color of their skin, wrote Representative Burgess Owens, a Republican of Utah, in a statement. Critical race theory preserves this way of thinking and undermines civil rights, constitutionally guaranteed equal protection before the law, and U.S. institutions at large.
I grew up in the Deep South during the days of KKK, Jim Crow, and segregation. I have felt the pain of racism and have seen and experienced firsthand when people act unjustly toward others due to the color of their skin. And yes, it still happens today when individuals choose hate. Once an unknown academic theory, the increasingly pervasive CRT, says that racism permanently stains the fabric of American society. The critical race theorists believe that we are defined solely by our skin color. They believe that American institutions preserves white supremacy. Some even believe that our nation is hopelessly racist. To try and make this divisive theory understandable, teachers often separate students into separate groups based on intrinsic characteristics like race, color, and national origin. In doing so, students are taught to judge others based on their appearance. In the 1960s, this was called pure racism. In the span of a few weeks, Democrats have gone from claiming the CRT was only a myth to boldly embracing it. They've gone from dismissing parental objections to endorsing indoctrination in schools across the country. The American people are right in their distrust. Make no mistake, I want our students to learn about the hundreds of moments that shaped us into the country we are today. Students should learn about slavery and its legacy. Students should learn about the Declaration of Independence, the United States Constitution, the Emancipation Proclamation, Juneteenth, Jim Crow, the Tulsa Race Massacre, and Civil Rights Acts. They should also be taught and be proud of a nation that for over 200 years has progressed, a country that's shown its commitments to its mission statement, that all men and women are created equal.
The whole purpose of critical race theory is to provide Americans with a way to understand the legacy of racism, even though those stories sometimes hurt.
What Kendall Thomas is saying here is technically true. Critical race theory does provide a lens through which to understand the history of racism in America. But what he's conveniently neglecting to mention is that crits such as himself view their lens as the only legitimate way to conceptualize history, and view every other lens as one tainted with the stains of racism, bigotry, and white supremacy. In a New Discourses article titled 8 Big Reasons Critical Race Theory is Terrible for Dealing with Racism, James Lindsay writes, critical race theory believes science, reason, and evidence are a, quote, white way of knowing, and that storytelling and lived experience are a, quote, black alternative, which hurts everyone, especially black people. Critical race theory rejects all potential alternatives, like colorblindness, as forms of racism, making it the only allowable game in town, which is totalitarian. And finally, critical race theory acts like anyone who disagrees with it must do so for racist and white supremacist reasons, even if those people are black, which is also totalitarian. In fact, as you might guess now, it sees the idea of colorblindness as one of the most racist things possible because it hides the real racism from view. Quote, while colorblindness sounds good in theory, in practice it is highly problematic. Wright Sensoy and D'Angelo, in their book, Is Everyone Really Equal? Colorblind or formal conceptions of equality expressed in rules that insist only on treatment that is the same across the board can thus remedy only the most blatant forms of discrimination. In other words, critical race theory is not a continuation of Martin Luther King's vision of a colorblind America. It's a repudiation of it.
Public figures have learned the hard way that supporting colorblindness invites a wave of punishment in the public sphere. Consider, for example, Senator Bernie Sanders, who, when he announced his presidential bid in 2019, went on the radio and had the audacity to suggest that voters should choose candidates, and I quote, not by the color of their skin, but by their abilities and what they stand for. This was in response to the criticism that he is a white male. So this was a classic expression of the colorblind principle, and to my ears, an expression of basic sanity, and years ago would have been lauded as a progressive statement. But instead of being praised for it, he was mocked, most significantly by Stephen Colbert on America's most popular late night TV show, who sarcastically quipped, yes, like Dr. King, I have a dream where this diverse nation can come together and be led by an old white guy, to laughs and applause by the audience. Now, had Colbert read what Martin Luther King actually had to say on the subject of voting, he probably would have held his tongue. This is what Dr. King wrote in his final book, Where Do We Go From Here? The basic thing in determining the best candidate is not his color, but his integrity. Almost word for word what Bernie Sanders said. It's a curious feature of our national discourse that the resonance of Dr. King's message now depends entirely upon the identity of the messenger.
It's taken, 50 years to move from Martin Luther King's central moral insight about the nature of somebody's character being the way you judge them, not some characteristic like skin color
does not matter.
Right.
Character is all. That's
Exactly.
Martin Luther King Jr.
Well, today not so. There was a lecture given the other week at Boston University from an academic who is at George Washington University, I think. Yeah, no, Washington State University. She gave a lecture in which she said people who judge people by the content of their character rather than their skin color are dangerous. Skin color is meant to be everything. And my God, we are hurtling there.
It's a total inversion.
Total inversion.
Well, how did I get where I am right now if some white man kept me down? How am I now directing over folks that look just like you guys in this room right now? How? What kept me down? What oppressed me? I work for myself from off the streets to where I am right now. You gonna sit here and tell me this lie of critical race theory? This the reason why black folks can't get ahead because of white folks? Are you kidding me? This is what we come to now. I can't believe we even talking about this right now. The last thing we're gonna say right here is something that's crazy. Martin Luther King said he wanted his kids to grow up in a world where they are judged by the contents of their what? Character. Not their skin. If they let this stuff go on right now, it is absolutely doing the complete reverse of what he's doing. So when February comes, don't talk about Martin Luther King. When February comes, don't talk about Black History Month. Y'all gonna sit there and just pretty much pee on his grave with this nonsense. That's exactly what's about to happen.
I have a dream. My 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
To finish off this video, I want to play a final clip from a piece the Washington Post did, which purports to present critical race theory from the perspective of its founders and proponents.
In Texas, for instance, House Bill 3979 says teachers must explore current events from multiple positions without giving, quote, deference to any one perspective.
There's language in this bill, like teachers need to present a balanced perspective on current events, for instance. You know, they have to do their due diligence to present multiple viewpoints. But what happens if they're talking about an issue in the classroom and they tried to present multiple viewpoints, but you know, the student comes home and tells their parent about the lesson that day, and the parent thinks, well, they didn't do a good enough job of presenting this viewpoint. So who decides when the teacher has done an adequate job of presenting multiple perspectives on an issue? It saddens me and disappoints me that instead of really embracing this opportunity to confront our nation's past and to tell authentic and more accurate narratives about experiences of, you know, diverse people in this country, that we're looking to sweep it under the rug. We're looking to erase it even further from our memories.
There's 3 things I want to address in this final clip. Number 1, that critical race theorists have a problem with American school classrooms giving teachers the opportunity to explore historical events from multiple perspectives without giving deference to any one perspective should be extremely telling. This is confirmation of exactly what James Lindsay has just said. Critical race theorists want to be the only game in town. No other viewpoint is allowed. Number 2, the thought experiment she objected to, in which a child goes home to ask his or her parents about their perspective concerning something being taught in school, and the parents giving their take on the lesson as somehow a bad thing, should again give you some pause. Are parents not supposed to weigh in on their own children's education? Or are the schools supposed to be indoctrination camps? And number 3, at the end of the video, she presents this idea of allowing teachers to present multiple perspectives on history as synonymous with sweeping racism under the rug. If based on what you have just seen in this video, you do not see how this ideology is dangerous, there's simply nothing else I can say.